Well, darling, you do look stunning. You look divine, darling.
Oh, Ethel, what is all this?
And during that time, I consider the years I spent on I Love Lucy to be perhaps the biggest ripoff of my career.
For decades, the world carried around a story about Vivian Vance that was more fiction than fact. Generations of television fans believed she had signed a humiliating contract, one that forced her to gain weight just so her co-star Lucille Ball would appear thinner standing next to her. It was a tale that seemed so cruel, so absurd, that it had to be true. And so people repeated it over and over until it became cemented as fact in Hollywood legend. But the truth? That contract never existed. Lucille herself, the woman who told the story, had only tossed it out as a joke during a party. She thought she was being funny, but the world didn't realize she was joking. It spread like wildfire, a cruel shadow that followed Vivian's career, shaping how people saw her for decades. And while audiences laughed at the myth, Vivian lived with far darker realities. Her life behind the cameras was filled with bruises, secrets, and battles she never wanted but couldn't escape. She arrived on set at times hiding black eyes, carrying pain she refused to explain. She despised a co-star so deeply that when he died, she didn't mourn. She poured herself a glass of champagne and celebrated. Hollywood worked tirelessly to bury those truths, rewriting her story into something neat and glossy. But today, the truth she fought so hard to hide, and at times to reveal, is finally breaking the surface. This isn't just the story of a sitcom sidekick. This is the story of a woman who clawed her way out of a cage, who survived a childhood that tried to destroy her spark, and who found her voice in an industry determined to silence her. Vivian Roberta Jones was born on July 26, 1909, in the quiet little town of Cherryvale, Kansas. Life in her childhood home was not filled with music or laughter. There were no bedtime stories or encouraging words waiting for her at the end of the day. Instead, the air was thick with discipline and rules. Her family was deeply religious, strict Methodists who believed in order, obedience, and sacrifice. But it was her mother who cast the longest shadow over her young life. To her, acting was not just silly or irresponsible, it was a sin. She told Vivian plainly that if she ever dared to step onto a stage, she would be marching straight toward hell. Imagine hearing that as a child, with your heart already full of dreams, only to be told that your passion was wickedness itself. Vivian grew up as the second of 6 children, but she often felt like she didn't belong. Where her siblings followed the rules, she wanted to break them. Where they fit neatly into the mold their parents carved, she struggled to squeeze herself into it. She was the dreamer, the performer, the one who wanted to light up the room with a joke or a dance. But each time she tried to show that spark, her mother would snuff it out. Her laughter was silenced. Her imagination was scolded. That constant suppression carved something deep inside her, a tension between who she truly was and who her family demanded she become. It was a battle that would shape her forever. When Vivian was 6 years old, her family moved to Independence, Kansas. For most children, a new town is a fresh start, but for Vivian, it became something more. Independence gave her room to grow, to breathe, to test the limits of her cage. She began sneaking out at night, not for mischief, but for freedom. Freedom from the walls of her house, from the judgment of her mother, from the endless chorus telling her she was wrong for wanting more. Under the night sky, she could imagine herself on stage, singing, dancing, making people laugh. At school, she found someone who finally saw her not as a sinner, but as a talent. A drama teacher named Anna Engelman encouraged her instead of condemning her. For the first time, Vivian was given permission to shine. She joined the cheerleading squad, entered beauty contests, and even performed in small school plays. In those moments, she wasn't the black sheep of her family. She was Viv, a name her friends gave her, lighter and freer than the heavy Vivian Roberta Jones she had been born into. Viv sounded like someone unshackled, someone who belonged to herself. But at home, things remained the same. Every time she stepped onto a stage, her mother pushed back harder. Every time she found joy in performance, the warnings grew louder. This was evil. This was shameful. This was the road to ruin. It was a war between two versions of herself, the dutiful daughter her family demanded, and the spirited performer the world was beginning to see. Slowly, she began to make a decision that would change everything. She realized she could no longer carry the name her family had given her. That name represented chains, judgment, and the small life she had been told to live. So she dropped it. No more Jones. She chose a new last name, Vance. She took it from a folklorist named Vance Randolph, a man who collected stories of everyday people, tales of freedom and rebellion, of voices that refused to be silenced. In that choice, she wasn't just renaming herself. She was rebirthing herself. Vivian Vance wasn't her mother's daughter anymore. She was an artist, a dreamer, and she belonged to no one but herself. Leaving Kansas wasn't easy, but it was necessary. She set her eyes on Tulsa, Oklahoma, chasing stages wherever she could find them. Each role, each audition, was another step away from the life she had escaped. She wasn't just running from her family's suffocating grip. She was cutting the cord entirely. By the time she walked away, she was no longer the girl who had been told that performing would send her to hell. She was Vivian Vance, a woman determined to carve her own future, even if it meant breaking every rule she had ever been taught. By 1930, Vivian was 21 years old and hungry for something more than small-town life could offer. That hunger led her to the Albuquerque Little Theater, a place that would become a turning point in her life. It wasn't Broadway, it wasn't Hollywood, but it was a stage, and that was all Vivian needed. In that modest theater, she poured every ounce of herself into the performances. One night, she was a sultry, dangerous woman dripping with charm and mystery. The next, she was a devout, humble nun, full of innocence and restraint. The contrast in those roles mirrored the two halves of her own life, the free spirit longing to fly and the daughter who had grown up chained by rules and guilt. Her talent was undeniable, and soon, the small theater that housed her performances was spoken of with her name attached. Locals began calling it the Vivian Vance Playhouse, not officially, but out of admiration for the actress who seemed to electrify the stage every time she appeared. It wasn't just her performances that left a mark. It was the way the community believed in her. In Albuquerque, she wasn't the odd one out, the daughter judged by her family for loving performance. She was celebrated. People rallied around her, offering encouragement, applause, and eventually, something even more important, opportunity. They organized a benefit show just to raise money for her, believing so strongly in her future that they wanted to give her the chance to chase it beyond the borders of New Mexico. That night, Vivian sang "My Man," a song heavy with pain and longing, and when she finished, the audience was stunned. The applause wasn't polite. It was thunderous, filled with conviction that they were witnessing someone destined for greatness. For a girl who had been told all her life that her passion was sinful, that moment felt like redemption. What had once been her greatest shame was now her greatest gift. With $50 tucked away and a suitcase full of dreams, Vivian set her sights on New York City. It was the city of Broadway, the place where real stars were made, and she was determined to prove she belonged there. But stepping into New York was like being swallowed by an ocean. The city was fast, crowded, and unforgiving, and Vivian arrived with nothing but hope. She worked as a waitress during the day, serving customers with a smile while her heart longed to be somewhere else entirely. At night, she rushed to auditions, slipping into crowded rooms filled with dozens of women just like her, all of them hungry, all of them desperate, all of them convinced they were the one who deserved the role. Rejection was constant. The dream she had carried from Kansas to New Mexico and now to New York was tested over and over. She learned quickly that talent wasn't always enough. Casting directors dismissed her, sometimes without even letting her finish. Money was scarce, so scarce that she often skipped meals, choosing instead to save her change for subway fare to the next audition. The glamour of Broadway was nowhere in sight. What she had instead were long nights in cheap apartments, wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. But something in Vivian refused to let go. Every no she heard only seemed to fuel her fire. She would not go back. She would not crawl home to Kansas and admit defeat. Finally, after months of disappointment, her persistence paid off. In 1932, she landed a role in the chorus of Music in the Air, a new Broadway musical. It wasn't glamorous. She wasn't the star. She wasn't even close. But she was on Broadway. For 2 years, the show ran, and with every performance, she chipped away at the doubt that had clung to her. On that stage, she was seen. Audiences began to notice her presence, even if she was tucked into the background. They noticed the way she moved, the way her expressions brought a scene to life. And most of all, they noticed something that would one day define her career, her sense of humor. Even in the smallest roles, Vivian had a natural comedic timing that made her stand out. She could land a line or a glance in a way that made people laugh without even realizing why. By 1937, fate handed her another break. At the last minute, she was asked to step in for another actress in the musical Hooray for What? What was supposed to be a temporary replacement turned into more than 200 performances. Vivian had gone from struggling waitress to reliable Broadway performer, the kind of actress producers could count on to deliver. That trust mattered. It meant people were beginning to see her not just as a chorus girl, but as someone capable of carrying bigger roles. And then came 1941, the year that would cement her reputation. Vivian landed a starring role in Let's Face It, a musical comedy featuring Danny Kaye and Eve Arden. The show was a massive hit, running for an incredible 547 performances. Night after night, Vivian walked onto that stage in front of sold-out crowds, and night after night she proved herself. She wasn't the small-town girl from Kansas anymore. She wasn't the waitress hoping for a lucky break. She was a Broadway actress, standing shoulder to shoulder with some of the best in the business. Yet even in the glow of success, the old wounds never fully left her. The applause was intoxicating, but when the curtain fell and the lights dimmed, she was still carrying the scars of her past, the shame instilled by her mother, the rejection of her family, the years of hunger and struggle. She had earned her place on Broadway, but success couldn't erase the pain etched into her soul. For Vivian Vance, the journey was always going to be complicated. The higher she climbed, the heavier the shadows seemed to grow. By the early 1940s, Vivian Vance had become a fixture on Broadway. She had spent years proving herself, night after night, until audiences and critics alike began to recognize her not just as a reliable actress, but as a true talent. But Broadway wasn't always a lifetime career. The theater was grueling, the competition endless, and the opportunities to reach a wider audience were limited. Vivian had proven herself in New York, but she wanted more. She wanted the kind of success that would not only validate all of her struggles, but also ensure her place in entertainment history. And that meant one thing: Hollywood. The transition from Broadway to Hollywood was never easy. Broadway stars often found themselves dismissed in California, seen as too theatrical, too big, too out of touch for the camera. But Vivian had something rare. She was versatile. She could be dramatic, she could be subtle, and she could be funny without even trying. Still, when she arrived in Los Angeles, she faced the same uphill battle she had endured in New York. Roles didn't fall into her lap. Instead, she found herself once again fighting for attention, auditioning, and being passed over. For years, she drifted between stage work and film auditions, never quite finding the role that would catapult her into stardom. Then, in 1951, everything changed. CBS was preparing to launch a sitcom starring Lucille Ball and her real-life husband, Desi Arnaz. The show was risky. Network executives doubted whether audiences would accept Lucy, a glamorous redhead, playing the wife of a Cuban band leader. But Lucy and Desi believed in their project and pushed forward. What they needed, though, was the perfect supporting cast, and that's where Vivian entered the picture. At first, Vivian wasn't the obvious choice. The role of Ethel Mertz, Lucy's best friend and sidekick, was meant for someone older, dowdier, less glamorous. Producers wanted a woman who looked plain enough to make Lucy shine brighter by comparison. Vivian, with her striking features and stage presence, didn't quite fit the mold. In fact, when she was first considered, Lucy herself reportedly worried that Vivian was too attractive for the part. But fate intervened. Vivian auditioned, and the moment she delivered her lines, everyone in the room knew she had something special. She was funny, she was natural, and she had the exact chemistry with Lucy that the show needed. Against all odds, Vivian landed the role. When I Love Lucy premiered, it didn't take long to become a cultural phenomenon. The show was unlike anything television had ever seen: sharp, physical, full of heart, and bursting with comedic timing. And at the center of it all was the friendship between Lucy Ricardo and Ethel Mertz. On screen, Vivian brought Ethel to life with warmth, wit, and just the right amount of sass. She wasn't just a sidekick. She was the grounding force that made Lucy's wild antics even funnier. Audiences adored her. They laughed at her bickering with Fred. They cheered her on when she joined Lucy's harebrained schemes. And they saw in her a reflection of themselves, a woman who was relatable, flawed and real. But behind the laughter, the truth was much darker. Vivian may have been perfect for the role, but the conditions she faced on set were anything but ideal. The myth about her being forced to gain weight was only the beginning. While there was never a contract, there was constant pressure for her to look less glamorous, to dress frumpier, to make sure Lucy remained the undeniable star of the show. Vivian, who had fought so hard to be taken seriously as an actress, was now being asked to dim her light, to play the dumpy best friend so Lucy could sparkle. It was humiliating, and it ate away at her confidence. Worse still was her relationship with her on-screen husband, William Frawley, who played Fred Mertz. The two despised each other. Vivian thought he was a bitter, washed-up drunk, and Frawley had little respect for her either. Their on-screen marriage may have been played for laughs, but off-screen it was icy at best and hostile at worst. Crew members often whispered about the tension between them, noting that their real-life animosity sometimes bled into their performances. Things got so bad that when Frawley eventually passed away years later, Vivian was reported to have celebrated with a glass of champagne. That's how deep her hatred for him ran. Her relationship with Lucy was more complicated. On the surface, they were partners in comedy, a duo that defined an era of television. But beneath that, there were cracks. Lucy's insecurities often bled into their friendship. She worried constantly about how she looked, and she feared Vivian might outshine her. The joke Lucy made at a party, claiming Vivian had signed a contract to gain weight, was meant to be funny, but it became a lifelong wound. Vivian had worked tirelessly to build a career, only to be reduced to a cruel punchline. And because Lucy had said it, people believed it. Despite the challenges, Vivian delivered some of the most memorable performances in sitcom history. Audiences loved her, critics praised her, and the show became an unstoppable force. But the price she paid for that success was steep. She often came to work exhausted, mentally drained, and sometimes physically battered from her private struggles. Yet she pushed through, delivering the laughter the world expected from Ethel Mertz. On the surface, she was the best friend everyone wanted. In reality, she was a woman carrying burdens no one could see. By the mid-1950s, I Love Lucy had cemented itself as the most beloved sitcom in America. Millions tuned in every week, and Vivian was suddenly a household name. But fame didn't heal the wounds of her past or the ones she was collecting in her present. Instead, it made them harder to hide. As the cameras rolled and the laughter echoed, Vivian Vance's smile masked a truth far more complicated than the sitcom world ever showed. As the years went by, Vivian began to feel the toll of her sacrifices. Fame had brought her wealth, but not peace. She often looked back at her childhood and realized she had been fighting the same battle all her life, the struggle to be accepted for who she was. Her mother had told her she was sinful for loving the stage, and later Hollywood told her she was only valuable if she stood in someone else's shadow. Even when the world saw her as a household name, she privately carried the weight of insecurity, rejection, and heartbreak. It was as if she had climbed a mountain, only to discover the peak was lonelier than the valley. Friends described her as both radiant and melancholic, someone who could light up a room with a laugh but later sit quietly in a corner, lost in thought. This duality defined her. She was a woman who loved deeply, fought fiercely, but was never free of her scars. And while audiences adored her, they never truly knew the battles that consumed her when the cameras were turned off. When Vivian's health began to decline, many assumed it was simply exhaustion from decades of work. But the truth was far worse. In the late 1970s, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. For someone who had endured so much already, it felt like life was delivering one final cruel blow. She went through surgeries and treatments, often hiding her pain from those around her, still determined to keep up the image of strength that fans expected. But cancer has a way of stripping away every mask. In interviews, she began to speak with a rare honesty, admitting her fears and regrets. For once, she wasn't trying to play a role or hide behind humor. She was simply Vivian, a woman confronting her own mortality. Friends said she carried herself with dignity through it all, even when she was frail, even when the sparkle in her eyes dimmed. She was no longer just an actress. She had become a symbol of resilience, and though she didn't always believe it, people admired her for it. As her time grew short, she began reflecting on her career, her choices, and her legacy. She knew the public still clung to myths, like the idea that she had signed a contract to gain weight, or that she had lived happily in the shadow of Lucy's success. Those stories were never true. The reality was that she had been bruised, misunderstood, and silenced more often than celebrated. But she also recognized the impact she had made. Millions of viewers had laughed with her, connected with her, and seen themselves in her struggles. She realized she had given people joy even when she herself was hurting, and that mattered. Before she passed, she told friends that she hoped the truth about her life would someday be known. Not the gossip, not the myths, but the real story of a woman who endured, who loved, who fought, and who never stopped trying to be seen. Vivian Vance passed away on August 17, 1979, at the age of 70. When the news broke, fans were heartbroken. They remembered the witty neighbor, the sharp tongue, the iconic laugh. But behind the tributes and the nostalgia, a different picture began to emerge. Colleagues and close friends began to share the parts of her story that had long been hidden. The pain of abusive relationships, the resentment she carried toward her co-stars, the loneliness behind the laughter. In many ways, her death gave her life a second chapter. Suddenly, people wanted to understand her beyond the role she played. Documentaries, biographies, and interviews surfaced, each peeling back the layers to reveal a woman who had suffered and survived in equal measure. And slowly, the world began to see her not as just Lucy's sidekick, but as a complex, courageous artist in her own right. Today, when we look back at Vivian Vance's story, it's impossible not to feel both admiration and sadness. Admiration for the way she broke free from her restrictive upbringing, fought her way to Broadway, and became a trailblazer on television. Sadness for the way she was mistreated, overshadowed, and forced to live with lies that weren't hers to carry. The myth of the weight contract may have been funny at first, but it symbolized something deeper. The way the industry often reduced her worth to appearances, stripping away her humanity. Yet despite it all, she left behind something indelible. Generations of viewers still know her as Ethel, the friend who stood beside Lucy through every zany scheme. But to those who look deeper, she is also Vivian, the girl from Kansas who refused to let anyone extinguish her spark, no matter how hard they tried. Her story reminds us of a universal truth. Behind every performance, every smile, every perfectly delivered line, there is a human being, someone with dreams, fears, and battles invisible to the audience. Vivian's legacy is not just her comedy, but her resilience. She may not have lived a life free of pain, but she lived one filled with courage. And now, at last, the world can see her not as a myth or a sidekick, but as the remarkable woman she truly was. Even after her passing, Vivian's presence didn't fade away. For decades, her image has continued to play across TV screens in reruns of I Love Lucy. New generations who never lived through the 1950s still discover her quick wit and natural timing, laughing as if the show had just aired yesterday. That timeless quality is a rare gift, and it keeps her alive in ways that fame alone never could. Yet what most viewers don't realize as they laugh at those black and white scenes is that Vivian herself often felt trapped by them. She worried that the role of Ethel Mertz would follow her forever, that people would never see her as anything more. And in a way, she was right. Casting directors struggled to imagine her in glamorous roles or serious dramas because they only saw the comedic neighbor. That kind of typecasting was both a blessing and a curse. It gave her immortality, but it also clipped her wings. This paradox is something actors still talk about today. How one role can define you, whether you want it to or not. But Vivian's influence stretched further than many realize. Behind the camera, she pushed boundaries. At a time when television was still finding its voice, she brought a boldness to her work that made her stand out. She wasn't afraid to challenge directors, rewrite lines, or demand that scenes be played with authenticity. She knew comedy worked best when it was rooted in truth, and she never hesitated to speak up if something didn't feel right. That kind of confidence wasn't common for actresses in the 1950s, especially those working under strong personalities like Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. But Vivian refused to be a silent participant. She earned her place, not just by being funny,